Good day, everyone, and welcome for all individuals joining us online. My name is Ali Khan. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Lead for the Federal Youth Network and a founding member of the Anti-Racism Ambassadors Network. Thank you so much for joining us today on what I'm sure is going to be an engaging conversation on evidence-based ways to impact diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. I'm an able-bodied cisgendered male coming to you live from the region of Peel, which is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe, and the Métis people. And most recently, it is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I do long for the day when, instead of doing performative land acknowledgements, we actually take actionable steps to decolonize our institutions and to identify and remove barriers which discriminate against Indigenous people. To that end, we're going to talk a lot about removing barriers today. But before we get into that, I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of opinions around equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism out there. Some folks think we don't focus enough on it. Others think we focus too much, while others believe we have to seize this moment where there is still widespread attention on systemic discrimination. Well, within government, if you're around long enough, you will know that everything happens in cycles. And it seems like every 5 or 6 years, we collectively realize that we are not diverse or representative. And as the largest employer in the country, we need to do better. In the federal government, we've undertaken a number of legislative and policy initiatives aimed at recognizing and improving upon the situation of certain underrepresented groups. Now, I'm not talking recently. I'm talking about the Employment Equity Act, which came into effect back in 1986 and drew attention to the situation of women, Indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and what was then called visible minorities. That was 36 years ago. The law was revised in 1995, but maintained a similar focus on those very groups. Again, employers were asked to identify and remove barriers that prevented the full participation of all underrepresented people. 4 years later, in 1999, not much had changed. And so a task force was created. And 1 year after that, in June 2000, the Embracing Change in the Federal Public Service Initiative was implemented. That was implemented in recognition of the fact that the government had not yet reached its employment equity objectives from the Employment Equity Act. That was 22 years ago. 5 years after that, still not much had changed. So in 2005, the Federal Public Service commissioned Canada's Action Plan Against Racism. This was touted as the first ever horizontal coordinated approach across the federal public service to combat racism. What might sound a little familiar now is that all departments, agencies, and crown corporations were instructed to identify and remove barriers and increase inclusion and representation. By now, you may know what happened as a result of this work, but if you don't, feel free to Google a report called Employment Equity in the Federal Public Service, Not There Yet. This report was created in 2007 and presented to the Senate of Canada on discrimination on the hiring and promotion of underrepresented groups. This report went on to highlight all of the recommendations that departments had in increasing representation and all the supports that they would be given and how the time to act was now. The reason I'm going through a bit of a history lesson here is to instill in us the idea that we cannot get comfortable. Each and every one of us has to realize that we have been down this road before. In fact, it seems like we travel down this road every 5 or 6 years. We have had numerous action plans, calls to action, commitments, and mandates, but no matter which department, agency, level, or branch you are in, a cursory glance at your org charts should tell you that we have been largely unsuccessful in diversifying the federal public service. I will say way back in 2005, one of our senior leaders did get something very right. It was Maria Berados, who was then the president of the Public Service Commission, who noted that given the relative success of the private sector in representation, it is clear somewhere in the federal public service there is a sticking point. The problem appears to lie below the surface, that hidden barriers exist within the system, preventing designated groups from achieving equitable representation. She was so right then, and she's so right now. Today, we're going to talk about how we can work together to uncover hidden barriers of discrimination that lie within our very institutions. Barriers which act as filters that prevent all of the diversity we see around us from being able to make it up the chain in the federal public service. See, each step of the way, from hiring, retaining, engaging, and promoting, we have hidden barriers in place which negatively impact discriminated groups. Canada, as I'm sure you know, and Indigenous communities have some of the most diverse cities and towns in the world. We have folks who are Black, who are Asian, Jewish, Muslim. There's people who are Métis, First Nation, Inuit, asexual, pansexual, transsexual, disabled, people who use wheelchairs, people who use sight-assisted devices or hearing-assisting devices, people who are younger, older, people who are new immigrants or racialized. All of these people can invariably be found throughout the federal public service, but no matter what department you're in, or what agency or crown corporation you belong to, or what region or branch you're in, all of that diversity is invariably filtered to reveal a middle and top of our institutions that are overwhelmingly white, able-bodied, and cisgendered. This is not by accident. We work in historic institutions that are serving the people they've always been privileged and excluding those that haven't been privileged. But we can change this. We have the ability to change this, and we have the will to see this change through. There are 3 easy steps we can undertake to make a definitive change in our institutions so that 30 years from now, we still don't have additional directives on inclusion, equity, and anti-racism. Number 1, employees in all groups and levels, please self-identify. Whether you belong to a systemically discriminated group or not, please ensure that you self-identify, because that is what's going to allow us to see how different employee groups interact with our systems. By identifying gaps in representation, self-ID allows us to find where there may be barriers in hiring, in retaining, and promoting different groups. This allows organizations to develop evidence-based action plans to improve and promote diversity and inclusion, as well as measure the impact of these initiatives. Number 2, senior leaders, particularly folks who work in senior management and in HR, you are in a critical position to identify systemic barriers by looking at self-ID data within your institutions to determine which employee groups spend longer in pools, which employee groups spend longer in acting assignments, which ones are given talent management positions, and which ones are not, and which ones are afforded training dollars, and which groups are not. It is the work you do with self-ID, data that will be critical in identifying where our gaps lie. Once we know where these gaps exist, we can work with folks in employee networks or people in anti-racism secretariats to come up with evidence-based interventions to close these gaps. And number 3, the third thing we can do is have our very senior leaders, our deputy ministers, our assistant deputy ministers, have them staying focused in this area. We need to move beyond book clubs and the celebration of dates. We need to do real anti-racism work, which involves encouraging your HR departments to provide you with detailed reports on employee disaggregated data by pushing self-ID within your institution so that you can have a more robust data set to help inform future decisions. Folks, today we're privileged and honored to have a presentation by Etienne Lalibert, a dynamic HR disruptor. he is hugely influential in the HR community and has taken the initiative to create a wonderful GC collab group with thousands of public servants in it. He regularly goes above and beyond and shares his insights with the broader GC community and has a wealth of knowledge on evidence-based research that can be used to make the public service more inclusive and barrier-free. Joining him will be my friend Ken Fortin, who leads the diversity and inclusion portfolio for the transformation and management branch at ESDC. Ken is an incredibly powerful speaker in his own right, and he's done tremendous work in that department in supporting the organization's efforts to serve systemically underrepresented communities. Folks, we are on the Zoom platform, and throughout this presentation, you will have the ability to ask questions and to engage with each other in the chat function. As we move through today's session, please share your comments in the chat space and questions by clicking the Q&A button in the language of your choice. You can vote for questions you like by clicking the thumbs up button as well. Without further ado, I will pass it to my colleague Alexa, who will go over a few additional instructions. Thank you.
Bonjour, mon nom est Alexa et je travaille avec le Réseau des jeunes fonctionnaires fédéraux à partir d'un territoire traditionnel et non cédé, Anishinaabe algonquin. Je vais répéter rapidement les instructions en français. Au fur et à mesure que nous progressons dans la session d'aujourd'hui, veuillez partager vos questions en utilisant le bouton questions et réponses dans la langue de votre choix. Vous pouvez voter pour les questions que vous voulez voir posées en cliquant sur le bouton poussant leur thumbs up. Je vous remercie d'être venu aujourd'hui et sans plus tarder, je passe la parole à Ken Fortin pour lancer cette importante discussion. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Alexa. And good day, and thank you, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Ken Fortin, and I will be your moderator for today's session. So I just want to describe myself for everyone. I'm a Black male with shoulder-length dreadlocks. They're tied up. I have a bit of facial hair. I'm wearing yellow tinted glasses with a salmon and pink plaid shirt. Although my daughter tells me it's pink, and I guess I can't fight her on that. So it's a pink shirt. All right, now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the lands we're meeting on is the traditional and unceded territory of many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. The land that I am gathered on is in Durham region, the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of Schuylkill Island. We recognize and deeply appreciate the historic connection to the lands from which your call is placed across Canada. We are grateful and honored to have the opportunity to live, work, and play in these communities, and by doing so, give respects to its first inhabitants. All right, now just a little bit about myself. I'm currently the Senior Program Advisor for EDSC, we're now Business Benefit Delivery Modernization. I'm leading DI profile for BDM. For that, I led the Racialized Canadians strategy for in-person strategy for Ontario region. And basically, I've been engaged in EDI since the Clerk of Privy Council announced the call to action on anti-racism, equity, and inclusion in the federal public service. Now, the first words in that call to action is the time is now. So I started the work then, and I've been working in diversity and inclusion ever since. So that's enough about me. I want to start things off with an icebreaker. Let me see how we can do our little icebreaker here. All right, so for the icebreaker, I'd like for you to go to your chat function, and in there, you will see some icons, I hope, that you can share, that you can use to kind of express how you're feeling. Okay. Alors, pour cette partie de notre séance, je vais vous demander d'utiliser le clavardage pour, ou sinon, vous pouvez laisser, you can also use a thumbs up. We'll use a thumbs up or le pouce levé for this segment. So, alors, notre activité est très simple. C'est à propos de diversité. Donc, je vais nommer les groupes d'équité en matière d'emploi. Et je vais vous demander d'utiliser soit le thumbs up ou les émotions, OK? De votre choix, si vous appartenez au groupe en question. So for this activity, I'll be naming some of the EE groups, the employment equity groups. So please use the emotions buttons or the thumbs up, okay? If you belong to or identify with the EE group. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I didn't have my camera on. Apologies. Now you can see me. All right. So, is everyone ready? Let me get a few thumbs up going. See if folks, all right. I see some thumbs up. All right. Okay. So first up, First Nations. If you belong to the Indigenous Employment Equity Group, please let us know and give us a thumbs up, give us an emoji. Let's see what you got. Representation from the Indigenous community. Oh, I see some hearts, some smiley faces. Okay. All right, c'est le cercle des employés autochtones. S'il vous plaît, cliquez les émotions, utilisez le clavardage. Okay. Excellent. Oh man, we got some good representation. All right, okay. Next is the persons in positions of disability, otherwise known as PWD, le réseau des employés plutôt en position d'handicap. All right, get ready. You're coming up next. Now it's your time to let us know you're in the house and give us some of those emojis, some thumbs up. I see that. Okay, I see some good activity there. All right. Okay, a nice peace sign, thumbs up. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. All right. Now, this is one of my favorite groups. All right. It's the Women's Network. And we're not talking about Oprah. All right. We're not talking about Oprah. Okay. Le Réseau des femmes. Allez-y. If you are or identify as a woman, go ahead and hit those emojis. Oh, all right. Okay. I see some nice. Okay. The women are livening it up. The people who identify women are livening it up as well. All right. This is going good. This is going really good. Okay. All right. Okay. Now, I know we have pride here at ESDC. All right. I know we got some pride here at ESDC. So, or in government altogether. All right. So, all my 2SLGBTQIA plus people, where are you at? Le réseau de la fierté des emplois. Veuillez allumer cet écran avec votre présence. Hey, there we go. Yes. Got a lot of rainbows going. Oh man, the rainbow flag is flying here. Okay. All right. Okay. Et maintenant, mon secteur. Tous les employés faisant partie ou part du réseau des minorités visibles. Allez-y. Now, Visible Minority Network. Let's get it. Very creative. And I gotta say, very creative with those emojis. I'm liking it. All right. I got the pound, the daps. Okay. Some people represent. Oh man. Ooh, live. Okay. All right. It's going good. Okay, and now my community. All right. Black Employees Network, le réseau des employés noirs. Let's go. Smash that button. Let's go. Let's see it. Hey, oh, here we go. Yes. Thumbs up, pounds. Yes, we're getting it. Okay. So we got all the groups. Okay, but we're not done just yet with the shout outs. All right. Another community that I belong to. So this is community I belong to. It's a minority community across Canada, except Quebec. Of course, la communauté francophone. Épuisez le bouton des émotions. Let's go. Communauté francophone, where you at? Eh oui, OK. Ben oui, fleur de lys. OK. Ben oui. Et sac passé. Ouais, Marc Boulet. All right. OK. All right. Doing good. All right. Last and not least, this is a very important group. And they play an instrumental role in DI. That's why I'm talking about the allies, nos alliés. If you are an ally to any or all of the EE groups, smash that button right now. Light it up. Hey, that's right. This is what kind of session this is going to be, all right? And we're bringing it right now. Oh, 100, oh man, I got the purple hearts. I got the handshakes. Oh, all right. Okay. Oh man, that was good exercise. Good way to kind of get into it, all right? Maintenant, c'est le temps d'introduire notre présentateur. Étienne La Liberté. Étienne était un consultant d'affaires et gestion de projets de développement web dans le secteur privé et parapublic. Étienne s'est joint à la fonction publique fédérale en 2003. Depuis, il a travaillé dans 11 organisations fédérales, la majeure partie de son expérience portant sur la gestion des personnes et les ressources humaines. So after working on the implementation of the new Public Service Employment Act, Etienne joined the law enforcement branch of the Fisheries and Oceans Canada in the Pacific region and hacked bureaucracy by systematically conducting staffing processes in 3 weeks. Perhaps more significantly, he helped turn the worst organization in the federal public into the second best for its employee engagement. Alors, depuis 2018, Étienne est fermement ancré dans la sphère d'innovation en matière de ressources humaines. Il a entrevué plus de 100 organisations au sujet de leur innovation en matière de ressources humaines, particulièrement en ce qui touche la dotation et le recrutement. He researched productive hiring, an approach based on data and advanced statistics. Shortly after the pandemic started, he interviewed over 200 HR leaders across the federal public service about their views on the future of HR. He has also explored how we could use data to make staffing and recruitment more efficient and initiated a project examining employment equity in an annual performance review. Okay, so here's a fun fact. Etienne was the first non-official blogger in the Public Service of Canada. All right, and it's perhaps the first video blogger too, so he's getting it in right now. All right, so you can follow him on GC Collab. Now he's got more than 5,000 members. Follow him on GC Collab or on his YouTube channel or connect with him on Twitter. All right, now, without any more delays, Government of Canada, HR extraordinaire, I give you Étienne La Liberté. Étienne? Are you with us, Étienne? Just give me 1 second while we try to connect with Étienne. And it look, hey, there you go. Okay, there you are. And...
Merci Ken pour ce icebreaker très animé. J'ai beaucoup apprécié l'expression individuelle des participants ici présents. Merci Alexa, merci Ali aussi pour vos commentaires au début. Plus de 600 personnes aujourd'hui en ligne. C'est un peu intimidant pour moi. 600 participants. It's a little intimidating, I will admit. But I hope I can make a small difference today in sharing some insights I have for you. My presentation today will be bilingual. Mostly I'll do the talking in English, but I'll do so with my big French-Canadian accent for everyone to appreciate. Blague à part, pour mes collègues francophones, je vous avoue que je trouve ça toujours difficile de passer constamment de l'anglais au français quand je parle, mais je vais tenter de résumer brièvement mes principaux points après chaque intervention que je fais. Mais s'il vous plaît, à la fin de la présentation, si vous avez des questions pour moi en français, je vous promets d'y répondre d'abord et avant tout en français, donc n'hésitez pas, ne serait-ce que par marque de respect, je vais m'efforcer de le faire en français. Et deuxièmement, s'il y a un intérêt prononcé pour que je fasse cette même présentation exclusivement en français dans votre organisation ou dans une communauté de pratique, laissez-moi savoir, il y a toujours moyen d'arranger ce type de présentation-là. En fait, c'est l'approche que je peux faire, c'est de faire séparément mes présentations en anglais les présentations en français, mais tout le monde peut bénéficier du contenu en même temps. Donc, je vous remercie pour votre compréhension. Before proceeding, there's a lot I want to cover today. And since it's the first time I delivered a presentation, I honestly don't know if we will have time for the question at the end. If we don't, I will post the link to the recording of this session on my GC Collab page in the coming days when it's available. And I'll invite everyone to share your feedback and ask your question on GC Collab in the comment section below, the little post that I will create. So feel free to do so then if you don't have a chance to do it today. If you'd prefer to share your feedback, comments, questions in private with me, then just go to my GC Collab profile page. You'll find my current email address there. It's the best way to get in touch with me. I promise I read all my emails, so feel free to send me a private email if you want to learn more. Let's get into it. A bit about me. Well, Ken already provided you a bit of an overview of my background. I think one of the key experience there that is worth highlighting for the purpose of today's presentation is that I was part of this tiny tiger team that implemented the Public Service Employment Act in 2005. We were a team of 7 or 8 people working for an ADM at what is now OCRO. And my unique contribution on that team was I was developing a toolkit for managers to be able to do staffing under the new legislation. And I mention it because what I'll do today is a bit in the same vein. It's the intent is provide tools for people to do staffing under the amendment to the legislation that is coming into force very soon. As Ken mentioned, I spent most of my career at Fisheries and Oceans on the West Coast. Those were the best years of my career. I had a tremendous time over there. And I was working for the law enforcement branch, fishery officers. And for those who don't know, but fishery officers are law or peace officers under the law. They wear uniform, body armor, carry guns, and do most of their work on boats. I had a blast working for them. And what the work I was doing was basically I was managing most aspects of people management for this organization of about 200 people on the West Coast. And I had the benefit of having a 360-degree view of human resource management activities. Donc, j'avais la vue 360 degrés des activités en gestion de ressources humaines pour l'organisation, dont 95% étaient des agents de pêche. 95% of the employees were fishery officers. I'll take you back to that period to start the presentation today, because it was around 12 years ago. I'm going to say, perhaps even a little longer, further back in time than that. I'm going to say 2007 or 2008. We had just completed a very large recruitment campaign for which we had received over 1,500 applications to become fishery officers. And once we completed the process, I got curious to know whether the selection tools we had used for that recruitment campaign were creating any adversarial bias against certain employment equity groups. Keep in mind, this was 2007 or 2008, so it was a while ago. I looked at the data. It probably took me about half a day to determine the representation of each employment equity group as they progress through each stage of the process. And what this analysis allowed me to discover is that, first, the visible minorities abandoned the process at the written stage at twice the rate than any other applicant. And that coincided with the moment that they would meet for the first time fishery officers in uniform with their bulletproof vests, carrying their gun. And that's when they would realize what the job was about and that it was actually a law enforcement job. And in many cases, what we observed is that for some communities within visible minority groups, law enforcement work was not necessarily well regarded, was not very highly valued by the community or by their family. And that is the reason why they abandoned the process. And understanding that allowed us to do a better job at presenting the work in our recruitment material, make it very clear that this is a law enforcement branch. It's a job that comes with certain types of hardships. If you want to apply, please read this carefully, because this is what the job is about. Too often in the public service, we don't do a really good job at presenting what the work is about, and this kind of backfired on us. But doing the analysis of representation of employment equity groups in the process allowed us to discover where we could do better. Secondly, the analysis also made us realize that only barely 20% of candidates were women, when in fact, about 32% of the hires at the end of the process were women. So when we discovered that, we figured that probably our process was at the very least not biased against women. However, the big realization there was that if we want to improve our employment equity representation in the fishery officer ranks, we need to do a much better job at attracting a diverse pool of candidates where there would be a larger number of women. And that realization allowed us to, again, develop recruitment material that was tailored, that showed to potential candidates that, yes, fishery officer is still a male-dominated work, but a lot of women are joining the ranks and are thriving in that type of job. And there was some fantastic videos that were published on YouTube, where about 66% of the fishery officers that were presented on screen were female fishery officers that were having a great time doing this kind of work. In retrospect, I tell that story and it all seems great, but at the time when I was explaining to our HR folks at the DFO the benefit of doing this type of analysis, my ideas were met with puzzlement. And I would say they just didn't get it. They didn't see the value of doing this type of analysis when what I could do was simply hire 50% of women to improve the employment equity goals. And I never really pushed back on that, but this idea of auditing recruitment processes for employment equity with the goal of debiasing staffing and removing potential barriers through specific interventions we can do on the process was always dear to me, and always left me very confused as to why HR was not embracing that practice more widely. Fast forward 12 years later, and the Public Service Commission published an audit of recruitment of employment equity in recruitment process, and discovered, to the dismay of everyone, that several employment equity groups, most employment equity groups, in fact, were adversely affected in external recruitment processes. That include persons in the situation of handicap, Indigenous people, visible minorities, especially Black candidates who saw their representation in the recruitment process decrease as the process progressed, sometimes disproportionately compared to non-members of these employment equity groups. Donc, la vérification de la Commission de la fonction publique a été publiée en janvier 2021 sur les taux de représentation des groupes visés par l'État en matière d'emploi ont révélé des constats vraiment dérangeants. Et quand j'ai vu ça, je me suis demandé quel progrès on aurait pu faire dans la dernière décennie si seulement j'avais été davantage capable de vendre le bénéfice de faire une vérification interne de chacun de mes processus de recrutement que je faisais déjà en 2007. So the realization I had was a bit of a disappointment at how much progress we could have made in the last decade if only I would have done a better job at selling the importance of this idea of analyzing the employment equity representation in recruitment process. If I would have only pushed the idea further, sell it to the right people, maybe it would have become a more widely adopted practice across the public service. And maybe we wouldn't be in a situation in 2022 where we need to amend the legislation to improve the numbers because we are not voluntarily introducing practices that could make a difference. So, as I mentioned, the Public Service Employment Act has been amended this year, and the big new requirement is that in the future, before using any assessment method, we will be obligated to conduct an evaluation to identify whether assessment method and the manner in which it is applied includes or create biases or barriers that may disadvantage people belonging to any employment or employment equity seeking group, and then make the reasonable efforts to remove it or mitigate its impact on those persons. Donc, la grande modification qui a été apportée à la loi sur l'emploi en 2022, c'est que dorénavant, il va falloir faire l'évaluation pour établir si les méthodes envisagées pour l'évaluation des qualifications créent des préjugés ou des obstacles qui désavantage les personnes qui viennent des groupes d'équité en emploi et, le cas échéant, déployer des efforts raisonnables pour éliminer ou atténuer les effets sur ces personnes. I've been observing from a distance some of the guides that are currently being drafted and where the guidance is going, how it may unfold. And I have a few big concerns. One is that we are seriously at risk of creating a bureaucratic monster with this new amendment. Number two, it's quite obvious to me, based on my experience on implementing the PSCA back in 2005, that the very first steps will be difficult to take, and especially if the guidance that we provide to managers to apply this new requirement of the legislation is too abstract, and if the managers are not supported by very, very capable HR advisors. And lastly, obviously, if we implement this amendment poorly with half measures or doing what feels good rather than what works, there's a chance that we make little to no impact with this amendment. Donc, j'ai certaines réserves face à la direction que va prendre l'application de ces outils qui vont guider comment on applique les changements à la loi. Tout d'abord, il y a des risques bien réels qu'on crée un monstre bureaucratique d'une taille inimaginable. Deuxièmement, il faut s'assurer que les directives qu'on donne soient le moins abstraites possible. Sinon, les gestionnaires qui ne sont pas adéquatement soutenus par leur RH ne sauront pas quoi faire avec les outils qu'on leur fournit. Et finalement, si on met en place des demi-mesures ou si on va avec ce qui semble être une bonne idée plutôt que ce qui est démontré qui fonctionne, on va avoir peu ou pas d'impact avec cette modification à la loi. So what will follow in the next 30 minutes is a presentation that I might as well have entitled How to Debias Staffing, because this is the place where I'm coming from. My intention with staffing has always been to debias it, not just to achieve employment equity representation for the sake of achieving those targets. It's really how can we make the default staffing processes that we have in place as equitable, as fair as possible. And to do that, we must focus first and foremost on designing interventions on the process that make it very difficult, almost impossible for biases to influence the outcome and the result. So what I will present today are some practical steps that I would consider or that I will implement myself that could move us towards that objective. If you are an HR specialist providing advice to managers, you will find this interesting because I think it will help you come up with practical ways to apply some of the more abstract guidance that is currently being developed. If you're a manager doing hiring, obviously, you'll be able to take some of these ideas and implement them right away without even asking anyone for permission. If you are an employee that is asked to participate in the design of staffing processes. For example, if your manager has a vacancy to fill and approaches you and say, hey, I need some people to create a process. We need to determine which qualifications we need to assess. We need to develop tools. We need to assess the candidate. This will be of interest to you because now you have an opportunity to influence how we do staffing. And finally, if you are just a concerned employee wanting to bring tangible ideas to the appropriate groups and leaders within your departments, I hope that you will find some good material here that you can recommend applying, implementing in your organization. Donc, ce qui va suivre, c'est 12 mesures que vous allez pouvoir appliquer, que vous soyez un spécialiste en RH, un gestionnaire qui fait de l'embauche, un membre d'équipe à qui un gestionnaire demande de contribuer, de participer à un processus de dotation ou au design d'un processus de dotation, ou tout simplement un employé qui a des opinions, qui a des idées, qui veut améliorer l'équité en emploi et qui aimerait apporter des idées concrètes aux leaders, que ce soit les leaders de diversité ou les leaders en RH de votre organisation. Vous allez trouver des idées qui vont vous servir. So, 12 ideas, and I wrote those as if I was an HR business partner advising the managers within an organization on how to do staffing moving forward. The first recommendation that I would do to de-bias staffing is that we establish merit based on empirical evidence, not personal opinions or anecdotes. Unfortunately, the amendment that is being brought to the PSCA does not apply to the establishment of merit. So managers are still free to freely determine which qualification they want to assess. This can present a problem, and what I don't see being done in the public service is a truly concerted effort to establish those qualifications based on what is proven to make a difference on the success of the employee, on the quality of the hire, on the performance once they're in the job, but come up rather than putting arbitrary or random qualification upholster, really go with what the empirical evidence says that we should use. The best way to go about this is to hire an industrial organizational psychologist to do a thorough job assessment. Look at the performance evaluations of the employees to identify what are the high-performing employees doing differently than the average employees. Perhaps hold focus group with employees doing the work, their supervisor, perhaps even clients, to determine what distinguished a superior performance from an average performance. And based on that, develop a statement of qualification that is relevant to the job. Now, I said this is not frequently done, but there are a few exceptions. There is work that was undertaken by Service Canada last year, where an IO psychologist did exactly what I just described, and that allowed the organization to develop a very, very short statement of qualification containing only 4 qualifications for the hiring of PM1s in the department. This is a great example. It was based on reviewing 2,000 performance evaluations, 24 focus groups that were held with a total of 176 people. And what they determined in the end is that a PM1 really needs only 4 qualifications to do their job. One is about reasoning and analytical thinking. The other one would be a customer-focused attitude. Third, thoroughness, so the attention to detail. And lastly, adaptability. In an era where everything is changing so fast, we need employees who are adaptable. Donc, seulement 4 qualifications, capacité de raisonnement et d'analyse, l'attitude axée sur le client, être consciencieux, la capacité d'adaptation. What is fantastic about this is that they've done the hiring, and then they're going to correlate this information, the result of the candidates to the assessment that got them the job with performance data, and determine, close the loop and figure out, based on the performance, which of these 4 qualifications were predictor of the result that we're seeing. So it's really great work. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a presentation that was delivered about a year ago, where the director responsible for that process presented the process itself. So I put 2 links here. The first one is for ESDC employee who don't have access to YouTube. The second one, you'll find the same presentation on YouTube. But if you jump to the 22-minute mark, you will get an overview of what that process looked like. And what is great is again, that they are basing the statement of qualifications on empirical evidence. So that was the first interventions that we can create to reduce bias in staffing. The second one has to do, I'm going to make a comment on years of experience. Earlier this summer, I was looking at 351 appointments that an organization did for PE jobs in the past, since the beginning of the pandemic, since April 2020. And I dissected all the statement of qualification on those 350 appointments. And what I discovered is that by frequency of use, over 1/3 of all the qualifications were experience criteria. So even within HR, we still rely heavily on experience. However, the question is experience a predictor of performance or a better hire? If you look at the evidence, you will discover that yes, but it depends on what type of job we're hiring for. I'll give you a link to really interesting article that does a great job at simplifying an academic studies. And what you will discover is that years of experience are predictor of success, of great work, in two circumstances, where the job is of low complexity or where the job is highly complex. However, when we're looking at jobs of moderate complexity, years of experience does not make a whole lot of difference. And these moderately complex jobs are most jobs in government. Donc, une étude empirique qui est clairement expliquée, qui démontre que les années d'expérience sont prédicteurs de succès seulement pour des deux types d'emplois, les emplois avec un faible niveau de complexité et les emplois avec un très, très haut niveau de complexité. Pour le reste, soit la plupart des emplois qu'on trouve dans la fonction publique, ça ne s'applique pas vraiment. Donc, if you want to reduce bias when you establish your merit criteria, dial down on the years of experience and really question, are the years of experience what we're looking for, or are we really more looking for the ability to do something? You'll find, by the way, some guidance from the Public Service Commission to apply this. La troisième type d'intervention qui est possible pour diminuer les biais en dotation, c'est les CV ou les applications anonymisées. So the third example that I'd like to mention is anonymous recruitment or blind hiring. So when we anonymize resumes or job applications. Now, I know it's it's one of the most frequently mentioned interventions made by members of employment equity groups who are being marginalized in hiring. So it's worth looking at what the science actually says about these approaches. And there are not too many studies that have been done on the topic, but they exist. One of the more interesting studies that is worth looking at comes from Australia, where they piloted this in several companies, and they determined actually that, yes, anonymous recruitment makes a difference, but it specifically makes a difference for the most marginalized group of applicants. In their case in Australia, it meant Aboriginal women. And they discovered that when we anonymize CVs and applications, the Aboriginal woman being screened in, making it through the process, jumped up by as much as 22%. So very, very compelling numbers. However, other studies also showed that it's not all positive. Anonymous recruitment is very time-consuming, effort-intensive, and it may not always work in other circumstances. And one of the better sources of information can be found in this short article. If you only look at the summary, it's worth it. It presents the pros and the cons of doing anonymous recruitment. Other studies have also stated some of the drawbacks of doing blind hiring, such as this study coming from France. And ultimately, I think the decision to resort to blind hiring or anonymous recruitment depends on really the problem that you are observing right now when hiring for this type of job based on the candidates that are there. I think it's worth looking at your historical data before making that decision. It's worth perhaps experimenting with a mock process before implementing a very large and costly process. And I would say that don't miss out on the fact that perhaps hiding the data is really the best approach. As you will see later in the presentation, I will suggest some approaches that actually take the opposite strategy of highlighting what makes a candidate different rather than hiding this reality, and how that can improve employment equity hiring as well. One great article that I would suggest is this little, it's part of the report that TimeCloud produced about a year ago. They had a chapter on anonymous recruitment. I think they are much more eloquent than I can ever be on the topic. Have a look at it. I just pasted the link in the chat. But I think it's a good reflection of how you can look at blind hiring as well. Donc, on est rendu à la quatrième approche. Donc, pour ce qui est de l'embauche anonymisée, je vous dirais, faites vos devoirs, penchez-vous vraiment sur le problème avant de prendre une décision et considérez les pour et les contre de l'approche. The next one is probably the one intervention that is the most frequently implemented across departments, and that's to have diverse board to do the assessment of the candidates. There are some studies that have been produced that show that diverse board indeed make a difference, but only if the culture of the organization is there to support it. There are, however, there's no downside to doing diverse board, unlike anonymous recruitment. So I would say whether it produced the intended result or not, you should strive to have diverse board, even if only for the optics. That being said, I would strongly advise you that no matter who are the people that you put on these diverse board, the number one criteria should be to have credible people who are known for their impartiality and being objective, regardless of their belonging to an employment equity group or not. Having credible people is the first thing that you should strive for when you create a diverse board. It is one of the approach that I took at DFO when I was evaluating fishery officers. And I had on most of my boards the very first female fishery officers in Canada who was an exemplary employee, role model to a lot of people in the organization. I had also the most senior visible minority fishery officers sitting on the boards with me. And that just shifted the optics from assuming that the hiring decision would be done by the old boys club, as they were often being referred to, and instead being done by a diverse group of people, including one woman fishery officer, a visible minority, and a complete outsider, as I was at the time. So it really changed the optics. And for that reason, none of the appointment decisions we made during those times were challenged. Everyone went along with the recommendations that we made. Zero complaint at the tribunal. Donc, avoir des groupes d'évaluation diversifiés est une bonne stratégie. Ça ne contribue pas toujours à améliorer la représentation des clients en emploi. Par contre, il n'y a aucun désavantage à le faire, donc je recommanderais de procéder de la sorte. One really provocative idea that I use in almost every appointment that I did when I was at Fisheries and Oceans is separate the assessment from the decision making. Donc, séparer l'évaluation des qualifications du preneur de décision. So, the hiring managers was never involved in assessing the qualifications of the candidate. That was done by a group of people who would not be working with the selected candidate, who had no vested interest in hiring one individual over another. The only goal of the assessment board was to be as objective as possible in assessing all the applicants. Once we would conclude our assessment, we would identify the individual that was the best fit for the role and make that recommendation to the manager. In 100% of the cases, the hiring manager went along with the recommendation. There was one of the very first instances where there was concerns, questioning, a lot of discussion that happened between the board and the hiring managers, but in the end, the hiring manager went along with the recommendation. Separating the two entities does wonder, and it eliminates the influence that first impressions might have when you're assessing candidates, that confirming bias might have on the part of the manager. Because typically, when a manager is involved, let's say, in conducting interviews with a candidate, the manager forms an opinion of the individual in the first 4 minutes of the interview. And for the next hour of the interview, all the manager is doing is confirming the first impression that they got in the first 4 minutes. So they're not really objectively assessing the candidate. They're just confirming that first impression. So separating the assessment from the decision maker is a great way, perhaps one of the best way to improve or reduce bias, and probably by extension have a bit of influence in improving diversity hiring. A bit along the same lines, donc un peu de la même façon, en plus de séparer l'évaluation des candidats du preneur de décision, je suggérerais de séparer les différentes parties de l'évaluation des candidats, les différentes qualifications entre différents évaluateurs. A bit of a complement to the strategy that I just recommend, but you might as well go further and separate the assessment of individual qualifications by handing them to different evaluators. This will have the effect of reducing or eliminate completely what we call the halo effect and the horn effect. The halo effect is when a candidate will say something really brilliant that makes a strong positive impression on you, and then everything else that follows, you look in the light of that great things that they said, and you evaluate every other qualifications more positively because they really said something impactful on one of the other qualification. The horn effect is the exact opposite. One candidate will say something that is kind of poor, has little impact, misses the point, or perhaps it just ticks you off. And for the rest of the interview, you see all their answers in a similar light. So separating the assessment of the individual qualifications and handing them to different evaluators reduce or eliminate those two biases. I will say that this is an intervention where I myself have changed my mind. It used to be that as an evaluator, I prefer to see the whole picture. I prefer to assess the candidate on everything from beginning to end, because that was the easiest way for me to spot patterns. But it also presents a risk, and that risk is a confirmation bias, that once you start spotting once or twice a certain pattern that bothers you, then you just keep looking for that bias to surface again. So taking that approach, what I described, separate the assessment of individual qualification and assign each qualification to different evaluators is one way to circumvent that trap. La prochaine intervention que je propose touche les entrevues. So the next intervention has to do with interviews. I am not a fan personally of interviews. I have never conducted an interview where that I think added value that I could not have gotten otherwise. And too often, the stress, the pressure that the applicants face during the interview actually contribute to have themselves sell them short in the process. I've taken other approaches to assess merit. One of my favorite approaches is just ask the candidate, explain to me however you want how you meet the merit criteria here listed. You can do it in writing, orally, you can do a video presentation, record a podcast, you can give me samples of work, you can draw on your entire career, even stuff that has been done outside the public service. But I want the candidate to impress me, and the best way to do it is just like, let yourself loose, give me all you got, not constrain them to a certain format. However, I recognize that that interviews is the most common selection tools that we use in evaluating candidates. So if you want to go with interviews, I have a suggestion on how you can reduce bias in these interviews. And the suggestion is that instead of assessing, now that a lot of interviews happen virtually, via Zoom, via MS Teams, instead of assessing the candidates based on the recording or the live interview, generate a transcript of that interview and have the evaluators assess the candidate not on what they see on the screen, but just on the written content in the transcription of the interview. First of all, the quality of transcription that MS Teams does right now is outstanding, even in French Canadian. J'ai été surpris en utilisant MS Teams de voir que lorsque je parle en français et que MS Teams génère une transcription de la discussion, à quel point MS Teams est en plus capable de détecter les mots anglais dans le texte français et de les interpréter comme il faut. So the quality of transcription has reached a tremendous level of quality. And the benefit of assessing candidates on a transcript rather than the video interview is that in a transcript, you can tell the color of the candidate, you can tell them their gender, you will not pick up on the accent, you won't pick up on the tone of voice, you won't be able to be influenced by the body language, the hesitations that a candidate might have, which may be simply a product of their culture, lack of eye contact, for example, perhaps. So all these potential bias that comes with diversity are gone. All you can do is assess the candidate on the actual content of their answers. That levels the playing field. Ça serait ma plus grande recommandation. Donc, d'évaluer les entrevues, non pas sur l'entrevue vidéo enregistrée ou faite en direct, mais faites l'évaluation de l'entrevue sur son contenu généré par une transcription écrite qui élimine tout biais possible dans l'entrevue. Next point, where am I? Reference checks. Yes, reference checks. Reference checks are widely done because they are usually done at the end of the process. They don't make a big difference in reducing the number of qualified applicants, but they certainly have their place. I would certainly recommend any managers to conduct some kind of reference check before hiring a person. However, I would suggest that we improve the way many reference checks are done. The biggest trap that I see in reference check, the way they are usually done, is that we ask the referees for their opinions. And I'm against that. The way I used to conduct the reference checks when I was at Fisheries and Oceans, I would actually state verbally at the beginning of the reference check with, let's say, a former supervisor or current supervisor, I am not interested in your opinion. I only want the facts. I'm not interested in isolated incidents. I'm more interested in the patterns of behavior. And I'm more interested in the recent patterns of behaviors than what the employee may have been behaving like 20 years ago. And as I ask for facts, not opinions, I would constantly probe for counter evidence. So rather than ask a supervisor, is the employee dependable? If I ask that to a manager, most likely the answer that I will get was, oh yeah, the person is dependable. But if I ask, have there been instances when the employee was not dependable? Was this an isolated incident? Well, when the time before that, can you describe the incident? Are you aware of other instances where it might have happened? Then I'm able to establish a pattern of behaviors that are based on facts. And never have I asked the supervisor, what's your opinion about the employee? All I'm doing are collecting facts. And I would tell the supervisor at the beginning, or the referees at the beginning of the reference check, I'm not expecting you to make a determination whether the employee makes that or the candidate makes that qualification or not. I will make that determination by myself based on the fact that I collect in this conversation. So I'm only interested in fact. Donc, pour la vérification des références, faire fi des opinions, s'intéresser uniquement aux faits, aux patterns de comportement, aux patterns récents et faire abstraction du reste. I'm going to open a very quick parenthesis, but I've seen some departments send these templates to references so that they would have to fill out. And there are really bad practices out there. One such bad practices is where I was asked to rate a certain qualification or competency. And then the department was asking me if I feel that the person does not fully meet or doesn't meet at all the competencies, explain why. So basically, if I'm being honest and rate the person lower than I feel they are, it's more work for me, the reference. So that by design is bound to skew the answers that you get. And also, I think departments really need to own the process. And when they make a decision based on a reference check, not tell the reference check, you know what, if the employee makes a complaint, we will show them the references that you provide. That's cowardice. Own up to the decision. If a reference takes a time, like half an hour of their day to provide you references, use that and protect the information to the extent that you can, and own the decision to determine whether the employee met the qualification or not. So we need to do away with some bad practices for reference check. That being said, reference check, if done properly, are a great way to curb biases. Prochaine étape, les évaluations de rendement. Performance evaluation. Based on what I know, I would advise you to proceed with great caution and first ensure that the performance reviews in your organization don't show patterns that are consistent with biases. I personally would not use them, but the choice is yours. But I would say before you import data that was creating in a given HR process, like performance management, and import this data into a staffing decision, make sure that the data that is in here is unbiased. Otherwise, you are going to be replicating biases that was created here, bring it over here, and it's perpetuating bias across different HR processes. Based on the analysis that I've done, I would have a few advice if you decide to do an audit of performance ratings. But there are great differences between the performance ratings by groups and level. For example, when you look at the distribution of ratings for CRs, 3, 4, 5, or AS1 and PM1s, you will see that these groups and level get a very low percentage of above succeed ratings, which is completely different than if you look at a classification group like the CS or the ECs, where you see very high percentage of 4 and 5 rating above succeed for these groups. So make sure that you apply that classification group and level lens when you analyze the data. What I can say based on the review of literature that my former team and I did, most performance management processes are flawed by design. What they ask people to do is assess an employee based on a single number provided by a single person at a single time in the year, and in most cases at a time that does not even coincide with the natural work cycle of the employee. Being assessed in April is great if you work in finance, but it makes no sense if you're doing some kind of other job. And there are studies that have actually demonstrated that up to 63% of their variance in performance ratings was due not to the employee, but it was a function of the rater, of the manager, and only 21% of the variance is actually the actual performance of that employee. So effectively, what performance ratings tell you, or what they measure, is really not the employee's performance, it's rather the manager's experience of their employee. Very different concept. There are some fantastic studies that have been done on performance reviews. One of the most recent that every one of you should go and download is the one by TechSkill. It's very recent. It was published only a few months ago. But what I appreciate the most about that analysis is that they determined that the biases in performance appraisals can manifest in at least 3 different ways. One, choice of words, the qualifiers that are used to describe the individuals and their performance. And you will be appalled by some of the pattern that they observe when they compared employment equity groups. 2, the length of the feedback is actually an indication of some bias happening. The shorter the feedback, the more the negative bias is probably against these individuals. And lastly, they were able to determine or distinguish between the feedback that is actionable and the feedback that is not actionable. And again, negative bias manifests itself in being provided feedback that is really non-actionable. On approche de la fin. Le prochain exemple est pas un exemple qui a été encore testé de façon formelle, mais c'est celui qui m'intrigue le plus, basé sur une étude, et ça s'appelle le partition dependence effect. So partition dependence effect is based on one study that I saw It's very intriguing. It was done in a lab, so it remains to be seen whether it works in real life. But if it did, it would be fantastic. And the idea behind this is that when you create an essentially qualified pool, so you agree that everyone who makes in the pool, they meet all the qualifications. And now it's only up to the manager to decide who they are going to select out of all the people that are in that pool. Rather than hide employment equity data, or rather than provide just a long list of people and just let the manager randomly pick the people from that list, present options to the manager and group the qualified candidates by their employment equity affiliation. So maybe on the left, you will have the man, on the right, the woman. Maybe on the top, you will have the visible minorities, and then in the other section, those who don't belong to that group. And you do that for all the groups. And what they observed happen in the lab environment is that employment equity hiring went up 15%. And what they interpreted this as meaning is that when presented with all the options, most managers decided to take a little bit of each. They deliberately aim to do diversity hiring, which did not happen when everyone was clustered anonymously or under a whole list. So this is very intriguing. It's the one experiment that I'm most curious about, that I would like to replicate in a real world, and perhaps have a control group, like present a list or a group of managers who are just presented a generic list, and to another group of managers, separate the candidates by employment equity group and see if there's any difference between the two. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to the summary of the study. So that's the easier way to make sense of the study. And then I'm going to put also the source of the study as well. Have a look at it. It's not proven yet, but it's really, really intriguing material. And I hope that definitely some organization experiment around that idea that I just described. Finally, the last recommendation that I would make is, if you want to debias staffing, is to collect post-hire data and correlate it to the selection data. It goes back to the very first intervention that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, which was to establish merit based on empirical evidence. So if you want to be able to do that, once the people are hired, you need to look at how well they're doing. Perhaps the level of retention, the level of satisfaction in the job, their objective performance data. And you take all of that and you correlate it with their result in the selection process to identify when someone scores high in the selection process on disqualification, does it reflect in high performance once they hired? Again, the best example of that is what Service Canada is currently doing as we're speaking. I'm eager to see what will come out of that study, but this is the intent, is to have performance data inform in the future the qualifications that are put on job posters. It's what any department that hires for specific jobs on a high volume should aim for. Determine what are the qualifications that really makes a difference on the success and the performance of the employee. I'll give you a link. I won't get into the detail, but it ties in with this idea of predictive hiring that I studied a few years ago when I was at the Canada School of Public Service. I even created a little prototype based on real data that showed that, yes, when you use post-hire data, it can indeed inform the qualifications that are most relevant for hiring. So I'm going to paste a link in the chat. Go watch the video. It's only 10 minutes long, but it's a very real case. It's based on real data, and it will show you how we could improve staffing in general, how we can take staffing to the next level moving forward. So, ça complète les 12 interventions que je voulais vous présenter aujourd'hui. Je n'ai pas fait de PowerPoint pour la présentation aujourd'hui, mais quand je vais publier le lien vers l'enregistrement vidéo, je vais mettre quelques notes utiles ainsi que des liens, des URL que j'ai mentionnés dans mon post, comme ça vous serez capable de vous y référer. So I didn't create a PowerPoint for today's presentation, but I will create an outline and provide the web links that I mentioned today in the blog post that I will share on my GC Collab groups in the next few days. In the meantime, I have some parting words. First, for HR advisors who are involved in the design of tools and guidance for staffing, I would the main question that I would ask is, are you ready to adequately support the managers to act on the principles that you highlight in your guidance? Managers are not staffing experts. They will never be. They need to be provided great advice, great tools. They can't be left to their own device. If you just hope that they will do something meaningful with whatever guidance you produce, you don't understand how the mind of a manager operates. Managers need to be backed by very, very competent and capable HR organizations. Otherwise, you'll fail to achieve what you try to achieve with these amendments to the legislation. Secondly, I'm wondering sometimes when I read some of the early guidance whether we are confusing biases with noise. Here's what I mean. Biases is a tendency to favor a certain pattern. Noise is a random pattern of error. My friend Ken Fortin, who's a facilitator here today, is also a basketball referee and a football coach. I read in his bio. And if I can make an analogy coming from basketball, if you have a basketball player who has a free throw average of 50%, and the 50% of shots that he missed always go to the left, that's the equivalent of a bias. It always going in the same direction, and you can work on that bias. If you have another employee that has a 50% free throw average, and the other 50% of throws that he missed are completely random. They will go left, right, up, down, not strong enough, too strong. That's noise. This is completely random. It's really hard to distinguish the two, but some of the guidance that I've seen describes the problem of bias or describe the problem of noise and frames it as bias when really noise isn't bias. It's something else. So be really careful as we develop these tools. And as I read the guidance, I mean, we have to ask ourselves, are we taking into account how modern staffing can be done and what technology can do for us in 2022? Or are we still presuming that we're going to keep doing staffing like we've been doing for the past 20 years? We really need to upgrade our practices and tools and consider what technology can do for us. And lastly, what I'm completely missing in the guidance that I've seen so far is, are we putting in place a basis for data collection, production, and analysis that will provide empirical evidence as to what tools work, what tools don't work, what interventions are having an impact, which one are meaningless. We need to develop that habit of collecting data and having the data inform our design choices when we create these staffing processes. Takeaways for employees. So all of you here in attendance today, I cannot stress enough the importance of self-ID. I've used self-ID data in the department to see how well an HR process was functioning. So basically what I did is I merged together two data sets, self-ID and the data created from that process. We analyzed it from every angle, applied really evolved statistical analysis to the findings. And what we discovered was conclusive, but it was only conclusive for the 53% of employees for who we had both the self-ID data and the process data. There was 47% of the employees that we could not account for in our analysis because they didn't self-ID. If everyone in the department would have self-ID, instead of 53% of employees we could have been able to account for, we would have accounted for 78%. So that would have been very conclusive results to determine the effectiveness of that specific HR process. So please self-ID if you have a chance. It's only by doing these kind of analysis that we can demonstrate the value of self-ID. But because we lack self-ID, there's hesitation about sharing the result of these analysis. So it's a chicken and egg dilemma. We need to break it. So please, if you have a chance, consider self-ID. Next, I would say in the same kind of line, but we can apply an employment equity lens on several HR processes that we have in our organizations, whether it's qualified pools, who has access to formal mentoring, training, investment, training dollars that employees have access to, or training days per employees, performance evaluations, access to coaching or career services, who use them, who has access to them, who has access to them for free, who pays for them, rejection on probation, voluntary turnover. All these processes I'm describing, we could apply an employment equity lens to gain better understanding of what are the dynamics at play here. So make the suggestion to your leadership to conduct such analysis and really go above and beyond just reporting on employment equity representation numbers. There's so much more that we can do with the data. We just need to get curious and build the capabilities for analytics around those. What I hope that my talk today will influence is that it will force everyone, but especially people in HR, to find out what works over what is familiar or what just feels good, and really try to dig into the root cause of a problem versus just addressing the symptoms of that problem, and come up with solutions that are sustainable, that can make a difference for the long term, rather than just investing in ephemeral effects where the impact of those initiatives will only last for a few months or a few years, but then we'll have to start the cycle again. If you have enjoyed some of these ideas that you have heard today, share them with your peers, your managers, HR. Suggest to your HR leaders and EDI champion to test them in your organization. And by testing them, I mean formal experimentation. There is capacity in government for formal experimentation, but we need to use it more. And if you're a manager already that has to make some staffing decisions, by all means, lead by example and apply some of these ideas. As I was preparing for today's presentation, I had initially set out on presenting you a completely different topic, still having to do with evidence-based and how evidence-based decision-making or data can positively impact employment equity, diversity, inclusion. But I had to change it at the last minute. And I think that if you start analyzing the data in your organization, some of you are bound to face the same kind of pressure, where some of the discovery that you will make along the way won't paint a pretty picture of some of the dynamics that are impacting your organization. If this happens, don't lose hope. Consider it instead as an ethical dilemma. And here, what I mean by ethical dilemma is I don't mean a choice between the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. I mean a choice between two right things to do. For example, making the choice to comply perhaps with the instruction of your managers or someone in your organization to not share the data, not pursue the analysis any further, or make another right choice, which is to fully embrace the call to action and share the learning, the findings, the approaches with departments. Two right but mutually exclusive choices. If you do one, you go against the other, and if you do the other, well, it contravenes to the first. So look at it as a dilemma, and take that dilemma and bring it to the attention of some of the people who might be your greatest allies. Perhaps it will be a mentor in your organization. Perhaps it will be your manager's manager. Perhaps it will be even their manager. Perhaps it will be your DEI champion. Perhaps actually the greatest ally you can find to disseminate some of these results is actually in a different organization, but they are willing to share more openly the type of analysis that you're suggesting to do. And once they set a precedent, then other organizations will follow. But don't lose hope and keep pushing. I'm saying that because as I was preparing for today's presentation, I faced that exact situation. At the last minute, I had to completely change topic, but I still believe that when the time is right, I will get a chance to talk about this other topic that I was really, really hoping to share with you today. This was my way of embracing the call to action. Small quote from the call to action. Someone said it earlier, but it says, "We must take direct, practical actions to invoke change now." This is what I've attempted to do today. Merci à tous pour votre attention. Je sais que les dernières minutes, j'ai vraiment fait un sprint pour terminer la présentation à temps, mais je vous remercie énormément. Allez sur JC Collab dans les prochains jours pour me faire part de vos commentaires, soulever vos questions. Mais on a encore 5 minutes, donc peut-être que je peux répondre à quelques questions.
OK. Merci beaucoup, Etienne. Let me tell you that the chat is on fire right now. Lots of praise for you. Of course, Etienne, I know when we spoke back in June, I had that same desire to want more. I was like, Etienne, give me more, but we ran out of time. So I'm really glad that we're able to do this and that you can share your knowledge on HR. Just one thing, I got a couple of questions, but I want to say this. Etienne, what's your calendar looking like for speaking engagements? Because I think it's going to go up there, my friend. So, make sure you get Etienne's details, get them in to your organizations for discussions. If you're up to that, Etienne, I'm not sure. I'm kind of putting you out there. Yes, do reach out to Etienne. It's every session is like this. I just feel like I'm always learning from you. So thank you very much. All right, we don't have a lot of time and I want to get to some questions before we go. We have a lot from the chat. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get to all of them, but I had a few questions that I wanted to throw your way just to kind of start our conversation here. So you talked about the 12 measures that we can incorporate in staffing to reduce biases. Now, if you had to pick only a selected few, which one would they be and why?
It depends what are the criteria that I consider. If I consider ease of implementing, then the short list would be a separate assessment from hiring decisions, generate a transcripts for interviews, reference check based on facts only, avoid considering years of experience, avoid looking at past performance appraisal, and don't impose any word limit on the content that people provide. If, on the other hand, I look at the most impactful interventions that I could consider, then again, a separate assessment from hiring decision, generate transcripts and interviews, establish merit based on empirical evidence. That will have tremendous impact, and collect post-hire data and correlate it with the selection data. So when I consider those two criteria, there are two practices that are found in both categories, and those are separate assessment from hiring decision, and secondly, generate transcripts of interviews. These two practices don't require any additional work in the process. They don't require any work on the part of the manager, and it's something that manager can implement without depending on HR. So I think those two would be the easiest to implement. Separate, like have a group of evaluators assess merit, and then leave the final decision in the hand of the hiring manager, but separate the two. And systematically, the interviews that you do, assess the interviews based on a written transcript, not what you're seeing on the screen.
Thank you so much, Etienne. Now, let me just quickly go to one from the chat. Is one that had a lot of, let's go with the one with the most likes, most thumbs up. Here we go. From an anonymous, can departments establish competition boards made up of folks from different departments? That's the question. My department is quite not diverse, so recruiting a diverse board is difficult, especially for those higher level positions.
Yes, it's a good comment, and it's true that creating diverse boards puts additional pressure on employment equity members who are identified as people who can be evaluators on these boards. The answer is yes. You can have anyone being a board member for your assessment process. But try, if you lack capacity within your organization, try to make sure that you build it over time.
Thank you very much, Etienne. Look, it's been a very engaging call, and the comments speak for themselves. Now, before we go, I want to say thank you, Etienne, for the presentation. It's been phenomenal, and I know we're going to connect a little bit later. Now, before we say goodbye, I do want to throw it to Josh Frame from he's the national chair of the Federal Youth Network. So, Josh, if you want to leave us with some closing words, please go ahead.
Excellent. First off, Ken, Etienne, and Alexa, thanks very much for today's session. And just a huge thanks to our diversity and inclusion lead, Ali Khan, who set up this entire series, connected with the experts, figured out all of the topics that should be included over the last month. And all of those recordings and all of those resources will be posted to our wiki site. So by the end of this week, you'll have the recording, be able to share that out with your colleagues. So keep these conversations going. Thanks very much for participating today. We peaked at over 600 attendees. So that's great news. Upcoming for the Federal Youth Network, we have a few things to mention quickly. First off is that we'll be starting some in-person learning in Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and Vancouver. Links for that will be shared in the chat and will be shared with you after as well by email. And then we're starting our GC 101 series in November. That'll be quick hit information on some topics that are of interest to new and young public servants, stuff that we think is better covered in 30 minutes, like ATIP, procurement, and things where 3 or 4 hours on that is not the most interesting topic. But 30 minutes, quick hit, what you need to know about that as a new and young public servant. And then the registration will be online shortly for Career Bootcamp. And we're expecting that to be, again, the biggest conference in the Government of Canada. So thank you very much for participating today. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Etienne. Thank you, Alexa. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde pour avoir participé aujourd'hui. Continuez ces conversations sur les médias sociaux et bonne journée à tous. Merci beaucoup.